Hello everyone, I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's Histories Lunch, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're here in the Nielsen Auditorium in our home, the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, and if you've not already done so, please silence your cell phones. I had thought I would be standing here today to encourage you all to come to the Mississippi Book Festival next weekend. I'm sad to say, spiking COVID-19 cases have prompted the cancellation of that event. As well, MDAH is suspending all in-person programs. That means this will be our final History is Lunch in person until the State Department of Health says it's safe to gather together in spaces like this. We'll try to shift back to our recent format of live streaming only. Our speaker schedule for next week is Karen Cox, who is also to be a book festival panelist. And so we're working with her to see if she'll be able to do her program virtually. We're committed to having some program for you next week. Today, we are delighted to welcome back our friends Pinnen and Charles Weeks to discuss their new book, Colonial Mississippi, A Borrowed Land, which is the newest volume in the Heritage of Mississippi series, which is jointly published by the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, the Mississippi Historical Society, and the University Press of Mississippi. Before I say more about Charles and Christian, I was going to tell you about a book giveaway, but all the books are given away. So, Christian Pinnen is an associate professor of history at Mississippi College. He began his studies in the North America program at the University of Bonn and University of Cologne, Germany, and received his master's and doctorate from the University of Southern Mississippi. Pinnen is the author of Complexion of Empire in Natchez, Race and Slavery in the Mississippi Borderlands, and he gave a History's Lunch for us earlier this year on that fine book. Charles Weeks, who gave a fine History's Lunch for us several years ago, is an adjunct professor of history at Mississippi College. He earned his BA in European history from Dartmouth College, an MA in U.S. history from the University of Michigan, and a PhD in Latin American history from Indiana University. Weeks is the author of 2 books published by the University of Alabama Press, The Juarez Myth in Mexico and Paths to a Middle Ground, The Diplomacy of Natchez, Bucfuca, Nogales, and San Fernando de las Barrancas, 1791 to 1795. We'll hear first from Charles Weeks. Help me welcome Charles and Christian.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you for being here. I'll begin by focusing on the title of the book, more, I think, the subtitle, and just the cover jacket includes also a portion of a map that's included in the book. And I hope there will be time toward the end to talk about that. But the title is the main focus here. Colonial Mississippi, which covers a long stretch of time, circa 1500 to 1800, but we do go a bit beyond 1800 and a bit before 1500. We have to bring in Columbus for anything on colonial things. What I would like to focus on here right now is this subtitle, A Borrowed Land. And what that means in terms of what we discuss is the fact that what was colonial Mississippi was a shared land. One more point I think to make at the beginning here is that there was no such thing, no such political entity as Mississippi until 1798, when a territory of Mississippi was created, and then shortly after that a state. So our geographical scope is more ample than the present state of Mississippi. But on the subject of borrowed, it connects with an argument that we make in the book, and that is that the colonial powers who came here didn't really succeed. Specifically, of course, the French, the British, and the Spanish. What they had to do was to listen and accommodate others. And a significant group there, of course, are people who lived here when they arrived, people we generally call Indians, better perhaps Native Americans. And another group that in a sense they brought with them, or certainly added to the mix of peoples here, and that's people from Africa. But right now, for focus on the Native Americans, I'll refer to a couple of incidents. One occurred in the early 1790s, involving a Chickasaw chief, Tasquiatoca, and the then Spanish commissioner to both the Choctaws and the Chickasaws, fellow by the name of, in Spanish, Juan de la Villebeuve. He arrived in the region in the late 60s from France as Jean de la Villebeuve. Villebeuve encountered Tasquiatoca, who was then regarded generally as the principal chief of the Chickasaws, to try to get his support to bring an end to some ongoing conflict between the Chickasaws and the Creeks. But he had a larger mission, and that was ultimately to create some kind of confederation of the major Indian, Native American groups in the region with the Spanish as a way to deter what all seemed to see as a growing threat coming from the newly independent United States. Anyway, Tasquiatoca in this context, I think, sensed that maybe Villebeuve was going a bit too far and used a word to the effect of telling him that be careful, don't try to go too far. You're in a borrowed land. And that term was used 30 years earlier by some Creeks at the end of the French and Indian War, when the French withdrew basically from North America. And what this particular group of Creeks wanted to communicate to the British, who took over from the French, was that they should not regard land that had been loaned to the French as becoming British. All that underscores the importance here of native groups who became rather sophisticated in dealing with these newcomers. So that's a kind of general thing to keep in mind here. A point about the nature of contacts between Europeans and natives sort of went in two phases. Roughly the first 200 years of contacts were essentially initial, and that will come out quite clearly, I think, when Christian Pinnen talks about this period. But beginning with the arrival of the French in the region, specifically we can say in 1699, to establish what became a permanent French post on the Gulf, on Biloxi Bay, the contacts became really sustained. The French remained for a time, then followed, of course, by the British and the Spanish, who established forts and communities and all sorts of relationships, trade relationships with the natives. Again, Christian will probably emphasize this because of his work, but we do want to focus, and we will, and we do, in the book, to, again, the peoples who came from Africa, not basically willingly, but as enslaved peoples. They found various ways to take advantage of just the open space that was here, but also in a sense what existed, and I'm thinking in particular here of the Spanish period, of Spanish law, and also the position of the Roman Catholic Church on slavery, which had really taken shape south of us in what we know now today as Mexico. At that time, it was New Spain. When some people associated with the Dominican order took a strong stand against the way Spaniards were treating Indians. Many of them are seeking just to convert them to slaves. Well, with that, I'll stop, and Christian can begin talking about this first period of contact.
Thank you, and welcome to everyone. As Charles has alluded, we kind of broke the talk up in how we conceive the chapters. He also used the term ample, and that's sort of what we found when we were trying to just figure out a way to kind of put the history of colonial Mississippi into one volume, first of all, and then one that is sort of telling a narrative, or has a narrative that flows. There's so many people that are involved in this early history from a European standpoint, and we do reference quite a bit. You will find a lot of suggestions for further reading at the end of the book and in the back of the book. So we transition a lot of that out or into the footnotes to make it more readable, more digestible in many, many ways, because there's such a specific literature on many of these things that we're just trying to sketch out and elucidate in the book itself. So that same goes then for our 40-minute talk here, right? We're going to do a speed read of, not read, the speed kind of cover of all the chapters, how we designed them. And as part of that, we start the book out with Spanish exploration. And particularly in the place we're here, right, Hernando de Soto would be the person to talk about there. Thank you, Charles. And what I wanted to talk about more specifically is sort of not a counter-narrative, but one that's really important for Mississippi, is that Mississippi was not settled from the east, right? We have this very classic American understanding of how settlement progresses. It starts in 1607 in Virginia and then moves west until somebody hits the Pacific. And that is really not what's going on, right? We have Spaniards and Frenchmen exploring what is now the South, SEC country, way before any Brit ever set foot anywhere near that area. And so this holds true for Mississippi as well, which was explored, well, haphazardly by happenstance by Hernando de Soto, who probably in the spring of 1541 made his way across what is now the state of Mississippi, but then was various Mississippian chiefdoms. And in the spring of 1541, we start this chapter with one of de Soto's maybe most violent defeats at the hands of a people called the Chickasaw. They surprised him and his, and Drada. Yeah, and so this is de Soto's path, a map from some of the narratives that survived. But they surprise attacked Soto, whose numbers had dwindled to roughly half their original size, roughly 350. That's just counting the Europeans. They always had enslaved Native Americans with them. They had a number of pigs with them, sort of a movable food supply. But the Chickasaw took them out, almost. The Soto's crew only survived with sheer luck, but the Chickasaw took everything they had in terms of food, clothes, weapons. They were really destitute after this attack. And sort of this is what Charles alluded to. It highlights that when we think about colonization, however you want to use that term, we don't think about people like De Soto. We think about companies or states who execute large-scale efforts to do so. And De Soto, as Charles said, was just contact, no conquest, right? He didn't have the necessary means. He didn't have the luck, maybe, that he experienced earlier with when he was part of the invasion of the Inca in South America. And so it was just enough of European contact to really harm the Native American populations, but not to truly start any kind of conquest, right? Otherwise, this would be a Spanish-speaking region and more akin to southern Texas than it is now. Overall, the Soto expedition inflicted environmental changes on the Mississippian cultures that existed at the time. And if you're familiar with local Native American or pre-European history, the Mississippian chiefdoms dominated the Southeast at the time. They came in various sizes, various shapes, various political structures. And there are plenty of books that I'm happy to point out that go more into detail on that. And we go more into detail in the actual book, but I don't want to distract right now from the overarching story. And the Spaniards tried multiple times. They tried the land route. They came out of Mexico, and they tried to go through what's not modern-day Texas and New Mexico. And the Soto expedition and that other expedition roughly came about to 350 miles from each other, and then both were turned around because they could not sustain their movement. So they came pretty close of literally running into each other, but none of them really worked out. They engaged Native American populations that were vastly different. The population, for example, the expedition that came out of what is now Mexico was engaged hunter-gatherer cultures. Think about Apache, other people like that. Whereas the Sotos were troops or people were engaging with largely agrarian people, Mississippian cultures. Both of them wealthy in their own terms, by their own definitions, but not in the terms that Europeans applied, which would be gold or silver or diamonds, anything you can turn into money, or that was money. So Soto probably arrived, as I said, in Mississippi late fall 1540, and then sort of met the Chickasaw and was able to get involved. Like, there was no actual conquest of the Chickasaw. The Chickasaw approached him. He had just left another battle in what now is Alabama, and so he runs into the Chickasaw, and the Chickasaw chief engages him in a negotiation. First, he demonstrates his military power to him by sort of blocking him from movement, and then he welcomes him in for negotiations because the Chickasaw chief himself is struggling with politics. He has two chiefdoms that are supposed to be delivering him goods. They don't, and so he needs Soto and his military to kind of go to these people and force them back under his command. And Soto sort of lets him be used because he needs supplies too. So there's a mutual relationship rather than like a conquest like we'd imagine, usually when it comes to this sort of short, long-term arc that we get into the history textbooks usually. As I said, that relationship sours over the winter, where the Spaniards do what they do best and eat everybody else's food without growing their own food. And that then causes the previously described attack. Now, De Soto has that effect essentially across the entire Southeast, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, South Carolina, some parts of Tennessee, then into Texas. And what he does, he interrupts and disrupts cycles of political control, of food storage for these agricultural people, and that has consequences. He also leaves behind, in all likelihood, diseases that Native Americans do not have natural defense mechanisms for. And so in the wake of Soto's entrada, you actually have a tremendous change that is sort of forced on Native American people, which they're not necessarily unaccustomed to, but it is dramatic. And so that hurts. And we see that in the people that come from that, because these are the people you know. We're talking about the Creek, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws. While they're related in names with some of the people that Soto meets, they're very different people. They're no longer Mississippians. They do have a different lifestyle, and we cover that a little bit in the book as well. The only people that survive in terms of being Mississippians are the Natchez people in the Natchez area. They remain mound builders until there's French contact in the early 18th century or late 17th century. And so these are huge changes that are wrought by Soto. And how, just to show you, before I relinquish my time to to Charles again, is the speed with which that happens. Because Soto, he goes to Texas, he gets repulsed there, he comes back to the Mississippi River, he dies of some mysterious disease, and his folks, or the rest of his crew, make it back, harried by Native American attacks down the Mississippi River, and eventually head back to Mexico. But that happens in 1541. Then in 1559, so just 18 years later, Tristan de Luna y Arellano sailed into Pensacola Bay with another attempt, this time at settlement. He brings a whole lot more ships, he brings civilians, and he sort of has the description of the Soto expedition. He kind of thinks he knows what he's going to get into and thinks he has a better idea about just tactics and strategy and how to do that. And when he sends his men out, I mean, he gets hit by hurricanes, it's a disaster, generally speaking. But when he sends out his men to these locations that Soto's chroniclers have marked and that people know about, these Indians no longer exist. Like, these towns are no longer there. They're smaller settlements. They're much more dispersed. They're not nearly as wealthy in food supplies, which they were counting on initially. And so within 18 years, these people find a very different kind of Native American population and much smaller people. And it destroys their attempts at settlement. They can't survive there on their own. And if you've been to Pensacola, lots of sand, not a lot of good soil to grow whatever they need to grow if they ever get there. And so it fails as well. And so the next expedition, that was the last one, right? And then Charles will take over with the French.
Yes.
Yes.
All right, well, quickly, moving on. While Soto was in the south and others there also, the French were creating a presence in Canada. And in the late 17th century, I think we're most of us familiar with this, a fellow by the name of La Salle and others came south toward the end of reaching the mouth of the Mississippi River. La Salle had been preceded by others. Père Marquette, for one, Louis Joliet. La Salle and his group basically was successful in getting to one of the mouths of the Mississippi. And in 1682, near present-day Venice, Louisiana, created a fleur-de-lis made of metal, attached it to a tree, and planted a cross in the ground, and thereby claimed ownership of a modest amount of land, all the land drained by the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River was not called the Mississippi River. La Salle named it initially the Fleuve Colbert, after the principal finance minister of Louis XIV, and a strong supporter of what we know of as mercantilism, a collaboration between state and private enterprise toward the end of expanding state power. The Fleuve Colbert became shortly thereafter the Fleuve Saint Louis, in honor of, well, the king and the patron saint of France. And of course, the entire region was named La Louisiane. La Salle made an attempt after that to establish a permanent position somewhere on the Gulf Coast, in part to deter the Spanish, who had established themselves well in present-day Mexico and in the Caribbean. That attempt failed, and a fellow was found to make another attempt. His name was Iberville. He was one of several Lemoyne brothers who grew up in Canada, Iberville the oldest, and had done good work on behalf of the French in what is known as King William's War at the end of the 17th century. Iberville put together an expedition joined by his brother, the next brother in line, Bienville, came down the, did not come down the Mississippi River, sailed from France, and by then the Spanish had become worried about French intentions and established a position at Pensacola. That happened in 1698. Iberville arrived in 1699, made a stop, sort of, at Pensacola, but then continued on to the coast, the Gulf Coast, headed west, and decided, well, a good place for a fort and a community was Biloxi Bay, named after a group of Indians living in the area, the Biloxi. So 1699 until about 1701 is when all that happened. Iberville and his brother and a very talented young fellow by the name of Pennico explored the region. They went up the Mississippi River, and one stop they made along the way was at where the Natchez were living. And the Natchez were very open. They entered into what we know now as a calumet ceremony that stretched over about 3 days, just the Natchez entertaining the French. And in general, the French had similar contacts with other native groups along the river and in the inland area along the Gulf Coast also. But not a great deal came out of that in terms of people actually moving from France to, well, colonize what La Salle and these other people had encountered. And in 1712, the king decided to basically turn the colony, such as it was, over to a well-to-do and very skillful, helpful financial advisor, Antoine Crozat. And basically what Louisiana became then was a proprietary colony. It was the domain of Crozat. It was basically up to Crozat to do something with this area. He tried, met some success, but in 1717 gave up the enterprise. By that time, another fellow had arrived on the scene from Scotland. His name, John Law. And John Law was a very talented, skillful, financier, and was happy to take on this assignment of trying to do something with La Louisiane. He created a company which was called the Compagnie d'Occident, the Company of the West, and went ahead to try to well, persuade people to move to the area and to provide in various ways support for them. He also did something that was in its early stages at this time, basically convert the company to a stock company with shares of stock to sell to people, obviously as a way to raise money. And the company d'Occident in that process came to be increasingly referred to as the Company de Mississippi. And there was a great deal of interest in acquiring shares. Law was a great promoter, successful promoter. So a boom in company shares occurred that came to a bust in 1720. And I have to indulge my liking of music here to refer to a piece of music that was composed in 1720 by a German fellow, Georg Philipp Telemann, who was living in Frankfurt, where there was a stock market. And I think he was actually living in the stock market building. He could not help being unaware of what was going on in the building. And he sat down and wrote a piece of music, a suite of several movements, called La Bourse, the stock market, the stock exchange. And one of the movements in this piece of music, he entitled L'Espérance de Mississippi, the hope of Mississippi. That turned quickly for many people in 1720 into Le Désespérance de Mississippi, the loss of hope. And in a sense, that term can characterize much of what follows in 1720. The company stayed on, took on the name the Compagnie des Indes, the Company of the Indies, to get some focus off Mississippi. But in 1731 decided to, well, call it quits. And at that point, La Louisiane became a royal colony. Now we have to mention one more thing here, quickly, and that's what happened in Natchez in 1729. The Natchez people continued, after the initial visits, to be open to these newcomers. And in 1617, the French decided to establish a post there. They built a fort, called it Rosalie. And that was followed by a gradual influx of people into the Natchez country. It was regarded by many as good country for raising various crops. But in 1728, a governor for the colony was appointed, a fellow by the name of Shepard. We're not exactly sure of his full name. So the short version here is Shepard. He turned out to be a disaster. And wanted to establish, as others had done, a concession in the Natchez country. Concession meant basically a plantation. And one little chunk of land he wanted included some really sacred ground, some sacred places, as far as the Natchez were concerned. It was a matter then of one thing leading to another. And a decision made on the part of the Natchez, whose leader, by the way, was the great son, leading anything much in common with the French. Louis XIV was known as the Sun King of France. All that came to an end in November of 1729, when the Natchez basically killed all of the French men living in the community, over 200. The women escaped death, as did the African slaves. But what that led the French to do was to wage what has been described as a kind of genocidal war against the Natchez. They fled, some of them, to the Chickasaw country. Some got into Arkansas. Some survived, but many perished. Basically, I think we need to stop there. After 1730, not much happened in terms of the colony becoming a success for the French. One of the things the French and other European powers at this time had to deal with was sort of ongoing warfare. In the 1740s, you had what's known as the War of the Austrian Succession, but the important war that brings about the end of the French venture was what we know of as the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War that began earlier in Europe, ended in 1763. And at that point, the French basically withdrew from North America, turning their land, their colonies, over to the British. So I'll stop there.
And as you can tell, time is expiring. So to sum up, the British, they didn't succeed at all. Charles forgot to use the clicker. These are some of the fancy maps we have in the book. You pause here.
This is an especially fancy map. It's a wonderful map done by Nicolas Bellin. And the focus here is on the Red River, a river that flows into the Mississippi. And up at the top there, the French established a post, a Fort Natchitoches, that turned out to be reasonably successful. We could spend the rest of the afternoon with this map, just in terms of what's on it. Iberville's name is remembered here. A river down here that connects to the lakes Maurepas and Pontchartrain was called the Rivière de Iberville. Just one other point here, you've got Natchez identified here, Fort Rosalie, and a note over here indicating what had happened to the Natchez. They basically had been wiped out. We should stop. The map is in the book, but it's not as vivid as it is here.
Charles likes maps a lot, so he is responsible for all the maps in the book. He did spend a great deal of time picking them out. They're fantastic. There are more. This is French. What is it? Is it Natchez? I think is it Natchez, Charles? Pardon me? Is that Natchez? I keep forgetting.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Yeah, there you go.
I forgot this. This is a map, but it's more art than map. And it's one done by a Dumont de Montagny, who came to the region in I think it was 1719, and spent time in Natchez. And here you've got the river identified as the Fleuve Saint-Louis. We don't have time to go on to, let's go on to the next one. The French also established a post along the river Yazoo, Saint-Pierre, that I think about 2 years ago celebrated its tricentenary, and there's a great deal of archaeological work that continues there. Again, we could spend time with this, but it's more art, sort of pure art, than in fact, going back to the Natchez map, there's one thing that should strike you as wrong with that. The Mississippi River basically runs, well, north to south here. This sort of looks as though it's going from, I don't know, east to west or west to east. So let's stop with that.
Yeah, we don't have. So the British got Natchez as part of the peace settlements after the French and Indian War with the French, which expelled the French almost entirely from the North American continent, and they were quite happy to leave because Louisiana was a drag on anyone's finances, and they pawned it off on the Spanish. But the British got this, and so this is their new sort of West Florida. You have East Florida here as well. And this, of course, is the death knell of the British Empire in North America because they cannot finance this. So you'll see them start taxing, then Americans get mad when they have to pay taxes for the first time, and you know the rest of the story. There's a Tea Party, apparently, and everything goes up in flames. And Natchez becomes the center of this. And in the interest of time, you have to read the story about that in the book. So Charles can tell you about the Spanish.
Well, in 2 minutes. Quickly, you have the American Revolution. And in 1779, the French get involved on the side of the Americans and persuade the Spanish to join them. The Spanish were not particularly interested in American independence, but they saw an opportunity here to regain some territory they had lost in an earlier war, the War of the Spanish Succession. Specifically, they had lost Gibraltar, southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula, and an island in the Mediterranean. So in 1779, the Spanish declare war on the British, and they replace the British at the end of the war. So at that point, we get into the period of Spanish Mississippi. Now a good bit happened then. I've been asked to think about the question of how Spanish was Spanish Mississippi, and a kind of a short answer to that it was not very Spanish. There was no migration of people from Spain. And even in terms of Spain, one can ask the question of how Spanish was Spanish then, and indeed how Spanish is Spanish today. A young aspiring soccer player asked me once whether it would be safe for him to speak Spanish in Barcelona, which is in Catalonia. But let's... What I'd like to do quickly is just focus on this place called Nogales. Does everyone know where Nogales is? And I think maybe I would kind of like to start a movement to rename Vicksburg Nogales. Anyway, the Spanish established a post, or at least began to establish a post, at the mouth of the Yazoo River. And in 1798, a Frenchman arrived on a trip down the Mississippi, reconnoitering the region in terms of its sympathies for the French. Now, this is the context here is the French Revolution, and there was a good bit of evidence to support a French view that there were people living in this Mississippi Valley area who would be happy, to secede, if you will, from the new United States, and maybe align themselves with the French. So Collot, a fellow by the name of Collot, made a trip beginning the Ohio River down the Mississippi to just sort of assess the situation. What came out of that were some really wonderful, maps of what he found. And one of Nogales, where the Spanish had begun to, indeed pretty much had already established a post. And then he went on to Natchez and came up with this map, which I don't think is accurate, but in general, it's a good representation of the community. I think I'm going to jump ahead and show you something else. I asked Christian to talk about James Willing. No. James Willing was, this gets us back to the American Revolution. James Willing had lived in Natchez, and he was not a terribly good neighbor. He developed some enemies there. He left Natchez to join the Revolutionary War effort farther east, managed to get a commission in what was called in the United States Navy, and created a ship, or acquired a boat, which got called the USS Rattletrap. And what Willing set out to do was to, again, sort of like Collot, make an assessment of places along the Mississippi. He spent 5 days in Natchez and managed to incur some debts. And so we've got here, this comes from documents that are next door at the Department of Archives and History. The Spanish, when they evacuated the area, left a large number of legal documents. Most of those, if not all, are still in Natchez, but they were microfilmed, so can be accessed here. And what you've got here is, in addition to legal documents, you've got some just communications directed to, in this case, Spanish officials. You have a petition of Isaac Johnson, and I could read you the text, but I won't. Basically involved Johnson encountering Willing at a place called the White Cliffs, south of Natchez, along the river. Johnson had with him at the time a very handsome horse that Willing noticed and wanted to buy. And what's in this document is what came out of that. An arrangement was made, at least Johnson thought, whereby he could be paid the $150 he would offer for the horse. That didn't happen. So what Johnson did, and this gets us into the 1790s, was to send a letter to His Excellency, Monsieur Miraut, Esteban Miraut, who was the French governor of, West Florida, that included Natchez. Johnson was not successful in getting the money. There's one other document we've got here somewhere, I think. Okay, sorry, it's out of order. I think it's important you see this. This is very interesting. This is in French. Another petition on the part of someone identified as Negresse Betty, directed to the then commandant, Spanish commandant, in Natchez, Felipe Trevino, reporting that during Willing's stop in Natchez, she had done some laundry for him and also had mended some of his clothes, but had not been paid, even though she was promised payment. So what she says here is that, describes that, and requests basically some help. And what this does indicate is that she was paid. And it's probably the case that Felipe Trevino paid her the money. Now, we're not going to have time to go into this. But this is a map I spent a great deal of time with. It's a Spanish map that comes after 1800 and connects with something we all know about, and that's the so-called Louisiana Purchase. And that happened when, or it followed what the Spanish did, or not the Spanish, but the French. The French decided, and this is the time when Napoleon is in power in France. The French decided to sell Louisiana to the Americans for a very low price of $15 million. And that happened. That aroused some concern on the part of the Spanish, because the Americans insisted that Louisiana extended, it's not too clear on this, at least draft of a map, all the way down to the Rio Bravo, the Rio Grande River, which would make it include pretty much all of present-day Texas. So what is emphasized on this map are these lines, colored lines, making a clear distinction between what the Spanish regarded as theirs, the province of Texas, and what the Americans could regard as theirs. Focus, again, it's on Natchez, and it's on a presidio that the Spanish established a short distance to the west of Natchitoches, Adais. And just one more thing here, the borders. You've got the 31st line of latitude. That was a contentious issue after the Revolution. The Spanish negotiated a treaty, or signed a treaty, and ending the war with the British. Nothing said about a boundary. The treaty between the British and the Americans ending the war did establish the 31st line of latitude as the southern boundary of the United States. In this map, the Spanish accept that. They accept the fact they're no longer in the Natchez area. But they make it very clear that south of that is theirs, at least down to what was the Iberville River. Again, we could talk forever about that, but I think we have to stop. And I hope you have some questions. There are, I think, 2 more chapters in the book that deal with the post-Spanish period. But
Yeah, if we have questions, we can
questions
raise your hand. We'll bring the microphone to you.
or comments?
What obliterated the Indians? Was it smallpox brought in by Hernando de Soto? Something obliterated them in the 18 years. Was it smallpox?
Well, smallpox was one. It didn't obliterate the Indians, but one statistic, interesting, that comes out later than post Soto, puts this is the late 17th century, a population of about 44,000 for the Choctaws, about 1/4 that for the Chickasaws and the Natchez. But that basically, that number dropped by about a half, okay, beginning in the late 17th century. And the reason for that, given by some, is the activity on the part of English people in the Carolinas to acquire slaves, of Indian slaves. And that's a big question that we have not really had a chance to get into. But that Indian slave trade, bringing these people from the Carolinas west, this exchange led to the arrival of diseases, smallpox, malaria, other things. So you have these, as a result of these European contacts, these significant, well, contractions of population, and then population, of course, of recovering. Does that help you? It's a complex, interesting topic. Are there questions,
Raise your hand.
comments?
Charles, will you tell us how Nogales translates and why it was named such?
Anyone here want to do that? No, nogal is the Spanish word for walnut. And the British came up with the name Walnut Hills for this area, the mouth of the Yazoo River. There were walnut trees growing there. And the Spanish succeeded the British and simply named the region, or named their post that they wanted to establish there, Nogales.
I should note, for completeness' sake, that Bill Justice, the former director of the national park there, objects online to your proposal that Vicksburg be renamed Nogales.
Well, I'm being light there, but I think Vicksburg has something of a Spanish heritage, albeit minimal.
Other questions? If not, I would encourage you all to take a look at the book. It is a really strong work. It's easy reading. It fills in a gap, and we're delighted to have it. Thank you all for being here. Who knows what we'll do next week, but we'll do something. And help me thank Christian Pinnen and Charles Weeks for this fabulous program.